So I just finished reading The Fellowship of the Ring for the first time in my life. And it was incredible. I will dote on it this essay. And I did the only rational thing you do after you read an incredible book like that. I rewatched the movie. For maybe the 50th time in my life. And I have to admit, this might be a slight hot take for a lot of people, but after always believing that this was the best movie ever made, and after watching it for the first time after reading the book, I've got to say, I still think that it's one of the best movies ever made. I might be totally controversial for saying that, but before I argue my case, make sure you like and subscribe. I'm reading Lord of the Rings for the first time and publishing video essays about my impressions and thoughts on the book. And The Two Towers will begin soon, so get ready for some essays about that. But I'm also going to read Brandon Sanderson's work and do some other things that I'm doing for Tolkien, and also tackling some other work like George R.R. Martin's and C.S. Lewis's, and just some other greats. And I'm a big Star Wars nerd too, so I will likely live stream and maybe host a watch party to watch Andor coming out in a few weeks. So subscribe for updates and become a member too for members only access as well as for early access videos and for book clubs. And if you want more information, just message me on our Discord. My name is John too, by the way. Some were asking me that, and I realized that in my 40th essay of Fellowship of the Ring that I actually never said my name. Weird. Anyway, I've been making these videos and there's always the inevitable movie comparison from book to movie. And I find the percentage of book readers who actually like the movie around like 20%. Not at all backed up by science, but just a quick take based on reading the comments for certain videos that I've published. And I do think that this is a different community too. I think more people here like the book and they kind of have gripes with the movie. So this might be a weirdly controversial essay to write or an essay to do in this entire community. But I think I'm kind of in that 20% of fans who actually really like the movies. I think it's probably higher in maybe a larger community of Lord of the Rings people. But yeah, I'm probably in that 20% of the community currently right now. And yes, there are some gross and terrible flaws compared to the book. But I think the one thing that we kind of all forget is that they're totally different forms of media. In one, you can flesh out characters and give them history and a backstory and give everyone at least some kind of depth of arc because you have the time. In a movie, I don't really think that works. In a series, I think it would, which is why Lord of the Rings being adapted into like a 6-part series sounds scrumptious to me. Wow, that was a weird word to say out loud. But a movie cannot go into the depths of every single character. I mean, think of a movie that has 9 characters where you get an in-depth look at all 9 of them with full character arcs and full history. I don't think I can think of a single movie like that, to be completely honest. I think it has to be much more focused. And so the whole journey is essentially the main characters in the movie. I think it's all about Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn in the movies. And so we leave out the incredible depth of my favorite character, Gimli, or even the depth of Merry and Pippin being more than just silly hobbits who have a knack for mischief and tipping over corpses into the wells of Moria. And you can't introduce the amount of characters that Tolkien has in his work because let's be honest, 99% of the people who are going to watch the movies are probably people who haven't read the books at all. So an expose on Glorfindel and his glowing appearance wouldn't make sense at all to me on my first watch through of this movie. But I will concede too, I understand that it actually upsets me a little bit that Jackson not only gave that role to Arwen, but had her glowing in Frodo's vision too. Arwen is not a sent back elf like Glorfindel is. So that was a rough decision, I think. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. I will say this, I believe Tolkien did about 99% of everything in the book better than the movie. But I still think Jackson, for what he did, made the movie phenomenal. And I will still sing his praise as a filmmaker that devoted himself to the story in a way I find few filmmakers truly do. Yes, again, it had deep flaws. And something I've heard a lot lately is that people call it his fan-made film, which kind of makes it more palatable to people who want an exact adaptation from the book. And I guess that does help too, but I still love the work that Jackson did. And I think that he did have a real respect for the books that seems to be lacking in a world where people just want to make a quick buck. But let's kind of get into some of the nitty-gritty of this book to movie change. Let's talk about the big changes. And I do want to go into chronological order, and I'm really only going to be talking about the big ones. And I want to do this to see if it's good or bad. I want to hand out fake points to Tolkien and Jackson for if it's a good or bad change, or if it's a good or bad thing that they did in either their writing or their filmmaking. And at the end, we'll kind of just tally them up to see who won. And quick spoiler alert for you. I don't think Tolkien did anything wrong in his writing at all, except maybe the end, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But let me know the big ones that I missed in here, because I'm doing this kind of just from the top of my head from memory, so I will surely miss a few of the big moments that Jackson just didn't include in. Like right now, I kind of wrote this whole essay and now I'm just kind of reciting it, and I know that I've missed the wargs that happen when they're on their way to Moria, but let me know if any other changes that I missed that you're just ripping your hair out because I missed them. Anyway, so let's talk about chapter 1. It just lacks the depth of detail. I think the movies do a great job actually of portraying this chapter because they do get the meat of it. Yes, we miss things like the whole preparation for Bilbo's birthday and the humor of the will that Bilbo leaves, and even the mayhem that happens when he disappears, but the film seemed quite a good interpretation of the things happening in that chapter. Because if they went into all the details, in the first 45 minutes of this film would have just been a party. Instead, we get lots of nods to the book, which I think is actually one of Jackson's crowning achievements. He knows that he does not have the time to include every detail in there. So what we do get are mentions of the Sackville Bagginses in passing, where readers can lean over to their neighbor watching and go, do you want to know how truly terrible they were in the book? First chapter is a point for both Jackson and Tolkien. I think it's great writing, but I think it's great filmmaking too. Now, the second chapter lacks the depth of conversation, which I don't think you can actually include in the movies. But Jackson, again, does give us the meat and potatoes of what this is. I will say, being a fan of Harry Potter, I was kind of gutted when I saw the final conversation between Dumbledore and Harry at King's Cross because it just lacked the biggest details and the big things that we needed as watchers and as readers in order to fill in the gaps for what happened in the movies. But I think this conversation between Frodo and between Gandalf, while it lacks the detailed information, gives you the basics, and it also gives the viewer the basics to understand what is going on in the story. Now, you do have some things like with the lines that Gandalf delivers, which are some of the most world-renowned lines ever, like, many that live deserve death, some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them, Frodo? Do not be as eager to deal out death and judgment. Even the wise cannot see all ends. Or the line, so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. All are happening in this chapter. It's a masterclass on writing. But then between chapter 1 and 2, 17 years goes by, which again is a good decision on Jackson's part for not putting this in. So 1 point to Jackson. But also a good point on Tolkien, because in writing form, this works really, really good. It's a better implement of writing to have this passage of time to set the stage for how the ring is really not having a huge effect on Frodo. He seems quite impervious to the ring. Now, I don't want to do this for every single point, because in every single one of them I could talk about for pages and pages about how brilliant of a writer Tolkien is. And I have 2 essays later this week that I want to talk about Tolkien being a writer, like how brilliant he is just as a singular writer, and then how brilliant the Fellowship of the Ring is as a solitary work. So stay tuned for that. But if you want insight into my thoughts on Tolkien's writing, just watch the rest of my essays. I think there's like 8 hours or something like that of essays on that. Probably more at this point. I might actually all combine them into one massive essay and publish like an 8 to 10 hour essay maybe later this week between the books or something like that. But I'm going to say this, Tolkien will win pretty much every single point here because I think he is an absolute master of the written word. But I still think Jackson, for working in the medium of film that he did, is doing a spectacular job. Now, another huge change that we have is the relationship between Sam and Frodo that happens kind of quick in the movie. In the movie, they're just buddies and they're friends. In the book, it's a servant and master relationship, and it slowly grows throughout the course of the entire series. Or, I mean, the first book. I don't really know the series yet, but it grows throughout the first book. The Gamgees essentially work for the Bagginses. But again, both work in the film and in the book, so I think points for both. Now, after this, we get a few long chapters where Frodo sells Baggin in order to avoid any suspicion of him leaving the Shire. And that's because he loves the Shire and wants to protect it. So he does everything he can to avoid having strangers come in and ask questions to hobbits of the Shire or get in trouble if they know anything about Frodo. In the movie, it feels like it's a last minute thing. And I think this kind of works for the movie. I don't think a 20-minute long thing of Frodo selling Bag in to the Sackville Bagginses and then them moving outside to Buckland would have really worked very well for the film. But it also works perfect for the book because it fleshes out the character of Frodo and lets you know his motivation. And it also lets you know Sam and Merry and Pippin, who they are. I learned so much about them in this chapter, and I lament that we don't get a deeper look into their characters in the movie. But I'm going to say this, and this is going to be annoying because I'm going to keep saying this. I still think Jackson does well because he cannot focus the entire movie on Merry and Pippin so much. I think it would distract most people watching the movie. Movies seem to be more like a rifle. You need a rifle blast right to a target. Whereas a book, you can kind of go in a bunch of different directions and go off on tangents to some extent. You have to keep it focused, but a little bit of deeper characterization for Merry and Pippin are possible in a book, and I don't know for sure if they're possible in what Jackson could do. Now, I know people are 100% going to disagree with me on that one, but I think out of this also comes a huge difference in Merry and Pippin, and I'm going to talk about this one for a little bit because I think there's a huge difference that I don't like so much. Because in the movies, they kind of just run into them by happenstance. They run into them in Farmer Maggot's fields. And by the way, Farmer Maggot in the book invites them into their house for a meal and to rest, and he drives them with his Horton cart to the ferry. But the movie makes him kind of a bit of an antagonist, which is weird. And so Merry and Pippin, who are unbelievable and beautifully loyal to Frodo in the book, they have a great little introduction here. And they tell him that they are following him to the end of the world and back. And they pretty much know everything about the ring because they've observed Frodo. They just come across a little bit dumber in the movies. Not a little bit, they just are a little bit dumber in the movies. They're kind of more tropish and they're a bit more like cliched. In the book, just them figuring this out and figuring out all about the ring without Frodo really communicating anything about the ring shows that they're brilliant and they're keen. It's a very big difference. But this is the point where Merry and Pippin just kind of become tropes. And it becomes hard to really redeem this in the movies. And one thing comes later that I'll talk about that kind of really messes it up for me with Merry and Pippin. And maybe they do redeem themselves in the third movie, but I've yet to read the next two books, so that's a different essay for a different day. But now we're getting into the territory where the movies just cut about 4 chapters. And I'll start with this. If there are 4 chapters you should cut from the book for a time parameter for a movie, it's these 4. Now, let me say this. Yes, I would have loved to see the Barrow-wights. I would have loved to see the Old Forest and even Tom Bombadil and Goldberry. But they're hard chapters to adapt and to keep focused on the first movement of the film, which is, namely, getting the ring to Rivendell. In the book, they go through this old forest, which is kind of like the Fangorn Forest of Hobbiton. When they get stuck, they meet Tom Bombadil and Goldberry. And I don't even want to get into who both of those characters are. Tom Bombadil just is, and Goldberry is the daughter of the river. So figure that out. Then, when they leave, they come to this ancient burial ground of a destroyed city where there are these Barrow-wights, or like these ghostly spirit things that pretty much lure the hobbits into this tomb and are about to put them into some kind of trance when Frodo sings a song to Tom Bombadil and he comes back and rescues them. Now, they get rid of the Barrow-wights, or Tom gets rid of the Barrow-wights, and then clears out these tombs of gold. It's fascinating stuff in the book. I love it. And it's so really, it's like, it just feels appropriate. It's so perfectly paced in the book. And I would have loved to see the Wights. I think that's a great depiction of like interesting, just an interesting visual that you could see in the movies. But I think it was a good decision to leave that out of the movie. And I just noticed, I think I'm translating or speaking book and movie a ton in this essay. I do this in all my essays. This is my one flaw, or something that a lot of people point out to me. I mistake saying the movie and the book, and this is all about the movie and the book changes. You guys all know what I'm talking about if you read these books and see these movies. So forgive me for all my little mistakes there. But I think it's a big difference. And these chapters that they cut out, I would love to see these in film. But if you're going to cut chapters out, these are the ones to cut out. Like, it doesn't advance the characterization. Maybe it advances the characterization, actually. But it doesn't advance the plot significantly. And I think the movie needs to be focused on the plot of getting the ring to the Rivendell in the first movement of this film. But anyway, after this, they get to Bree and the Inn of the Prancing Pony, and the movie and the book are pretty similar with just a few smaller differences. The ring wraiths are much more terrifying in the book than the movie. And Aragorn is much more awkward, and the biggest difference is that he's ready to be king, and he is not ready in the movie, which again is the big difference. But also, this might be controversial. I find that a great change from book to movie. For me, I love the idea of like a reluctant king, someone who doesn't want that kingly role and is thrust into that role, and he does really well in that role. I think the idea of Aragorn being a reluctant king makes so much more sense for a modern retelling of the story. And I remember talking to one of our Discord members a few weeks ago about this scene, and how he said that it's a decent change because it's a change in how the different eras portray the hero's arc. For our time and our era, we want them to be a reluctant leader who takes up the throne and grows into it. For Tolkien's, Aragorn was the leader who was ready from the start of when we met him, which is much more similar to the epic poetry that Tolkien loved. So for this, I think both points go to Tolkien and Jackson. I think they knew who their audience was and they adapted the character of Aragorn very, very well. Now, directly after this, the Weathertop story is pretty similar from book to movie. Again, there are always details that the book will do better, but for the most part, they're pretty similar. But the passages of time are vastly different, which I think is good for both Tolkien and Jackson. I don't want to kind of watch days of travel happen from when Frodo gets stabbed to when they get to Rivendell. However, and I will say that this is the first point off for Peter Jackson, one of the best parts of the book that the movies don't have is that there is another elf, not Arwen, that comes to save the day. Now, I don't think it's a bad thing they didn't include Glorfindel. I would have loved to see him, but oh well. Not a point off for Jackson on that one. But the point off is when the ring wraiths are pursuing them, Glorfindel commands the horse Frodo is on to ride over the river. So Frodo is alone when he crosses the river, and rather than Arwen standing up to all the ring wraiths, like the movies have, in the books, they have Frodo doing it, which is vastly and drastically better than Arwen doing it. And is in part why I think movie Frodo is like a lesser, weaker character. He just kind of feels weak and sickly. In this moment in the book, I was like standing up, cheering for Frodo because I was like, this guy is resisting it with everything in him. And it was one of the most beautiful moments in the entire book. And this is a moment I struggle with because it's a simple change that Jackson could have made that makes a drastic impact on the whole story. But anyway, make sure you go back and watch my essay on that one because I talk about it more on that one. Now, this is the end of the first book of Fellowship of the Ring. Now, there's two parts, and you guys all know because, you're book readers, about all these, splittings of this book. And I think the adaptation so far is not without flaws, but as far as a movie is concerned, is a pretty phenomenal movie. Now, let's move into part 2 of the book, which is just a continuation of the movie. Let's talk about Rivendell. At Rivendell, there are two main changes that I see. The first is the really deep and beautiful relationship that you have between Frodo and Bilbo. Tolkien seems to kind of love this and uses it as commentary for just what a good relationship looks like. But I don't think that's wrong on Jackson for not including that so much. I love the relationship that Bilbo and Frodo have in the books, but again, in the movies, you don't necessarily need that to advance the plot significantly. I mean, again, I've only read book 1, so I don't think that really advances the plot in a significant way. It's beautiful. It's beautiful writing, and I love it. It's some of my favorite writing that Tolkien has because it really shows how much they love each other, but it doesn't advance the plot significantly, at least at this point in my reading. But the second is the length of time that happens in the Council of Elrond, or just the length of the Council of Elrond. This in the book is the chapter. I loved it so much that I stopped making just one essay per chapter and made 7 essays for that single chapter. Go check them out on the channel. It's just an info dump of information and it's so stinking good. But I don't think Jackson is actually wrong either for whittling this down. And you might disagree with me, but I think the Council of Elrond section in the movies is exactly what needs to be said. Again, I feel controversial for saying that, but that's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. The Council of Elrond, although I love it in the books and kind of wish I had a full 2-hour movie just on that council, we get the basics, we get the things that we need to know for the plot moving on for the movie, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think that makes it a bad adaptation. Now, after the Council of Elrond is actually when I feel the movies are very different for the rest of the characterization and the plotting of the movie versus the book. They're almost going in different directions, and it all culminates in the ending of the book that I think is the biggest change, because it shows kind of the different trajectories that Tolkien was going in and how Jackson wanted to change that for a film. And I'll talk about that at the end. But these are changes that I feel after the Council of Elrond that are hard to come back to. And I wrote a full essay about this one in particular, because I think that this was like the chapter where both of them kind of deviated. So I won't really rehash this. Rather, you should just go check out that essay. But the main difference comes with the prior changes. So Merry and Pippin are chosen for the Fellowship because of friendship and loyalty rather than sneaking into the meeting for being jokers. I think that's significant for the characterization of Merry and Pippin, but I also think that Jackson kind of missed the character of Merry and Pippin, and he didn't nail them perfectly when he just had them running into Sam and Frodo in the field. That's a big difference, I think. Then after that, they also reforged the Sword of Narsil into Anduril for Aragorn. Again, it's the difference between a king being ready to be a king rather than a reluctant king. And I think that's a good change that Jackson actually made, that they didn't reforge the sword quite yet, because Aragorn is not ready to be king. It's a different hero's journey. And then this was my biggest gripe of the entirety of this book so far, from book to movie. And I will talk about this for the next few minutes, because the next few chapters are really about this character, I think. But Gimli has this whole debate with Elrond about how he will never leave the Fellowship because he is honorable. But everything the movie does, I do understand why they did it, but it's at this particular moment where I just wanted to see more similarities in the movie than differences. Again, maybe they're minor, but they speak volumes of these characters, and I will reiterate this. The movies cannot really be a story about Gimli so much, but in the books, when they go through Moria, it becomes a little side quest for Gimli. I think, again, for the movie, that might feel distracting, and maybe I'm just trying to justify the movies so much, but they need to be more focused, and they lack a bit of real depth in understanding who the character of Gimli is. So I think the point that Jackson gets off is for his treatment of Gimli, son of Gloin, which we get in the Moria chapters. Gimli is a fun, loving, idiot dwarf in the movie. In the book, he is a dwarf filled with honor, pride, and beautiful, beautiful purity of heart. He doesn't seem like he wants the ring either, but gets very excited when they get to Moria. Not because he thinks that Moria is thriving in any sense, but because a few people went back to recolonize Moria and they haven't heard from these guys. So Gimli is curious to see what happened. But when he discovers what has happened and that the colony is no more, he's reverent and shows his respect. It crushed me a bit to see what was really happening with Gimli when I rewatched the movie. He still has good moments, but compared to the book, there is no comparison. They're just drastically different characters, which makes me bummed because John Rhys Davies would have done that perfectly. He was the perfect cast role for Gimli, and I kind of just think they wasted his talent a little bit. Now, to subsidize the points that Jackson lost on Gimli, I am going to award him 2 half points for the 2 parts around these chapters that I actually loved more than the book. Would you believe it? The first is the change with Boromir that happens. I think the movie actually gives you better hints of the fall of Boromir than the book does. It might be controversial to say that, but the scene in the snow with the ring is great. It gives you a little hint as the audience watching that Boromir is struggling with the temptation of the ring. This doesn't happen in the book, which is why in the book, I just kind of made some essays talking about Boromir's fall seeming to come out of nowhere and that he seems possessed when his fall actually occurs. There's also a great moment before he checks out the ring where he is training Merry and Pippin, and you get to kind of see a fun-loving and very human side of him that I don't really think you see in the book. In the book, he's kind of blindly and pridefully brave, jumping in with Aragorn to even fight the Balrog, which is nuts. But in the movie, I think they are bringing just a more compassionate side to Boromir, that you just feel sadder for him when he actually does fall. Not that I don't feel sad for him in the book, but I think the little hints that you get almost prepare you for Boromir to fall. I think they do excellently there. in hinting at his fall and setting up the intensely emotional scene when he dies, which is, again, not in the first book. The first book ends with Frodo and Sam leaving while the rest of the company run to look after Frodo. So I can't even talk about that right now, but we'll talk about that at the end when I talk about the major differences between the ending and the directions that they're going in. But the next half point is a small half point for Jackson. But it's the password for the door to Moria. In the books, Gandalf just remembers the password, which a commenter pointed out to me is actually brilliant for Tolkien, seeing that he was a linguist and he was making a language joke about the mistranslation of a word from speak to say. I mean, all Gandalf really needed to do was say friend rather than speak it, which kind of implies that there's a more hidden password. It's brilliant in the book, and I love that for Tolkien. But I think Jackson and crew actually did something beautiful with Frodo figuring out the password with a riddle, because it actually connects him with Bilbo in The Hobbit. The two hobbits who have an affinity for riddles when they're trying to get into caves. I think that it's a brilliant and it's a small change in the movie that worked really well for me. So a half point for Jackson, which means he's only down 1 point. Now, we all know he won't come back because everything Tolkien does is brilliant. So he will never lose a point, but whatever. But back onto the Gimli stuff, because the next big difference was Lothlorien, and the change of his hatred to affection for Galadriel because of the kind words that she speaks devastated me that they weren't really in the movie. Again, this is my biggest gripe with the movie, is the change of Gimli's character. In the movie, Gimli is actually a bit harsher, speaking nasty words to the elves in the extended edition. That scene in the books just did me in. I wept when I read this interaction that Galadriel had with Gimli. It was so abundantly beautiful. And I tacked this onto the mischaracterization of Gimli, which just missed for me in the movie. Although I will slightly contradict myself also in saying that I love Gimli in the movie too. I think he pales in comparison with his book counterpart, but he's also just this silly and fun dwarf in the movies that I kind of love. Now, the Mirror of Galadriel is the next thing, and it had a few differences that I think it kind of stayed pretty true to book form from the movies. Now, I know some people will disagree with me about that, especially with Galadriel becoming this big green monster, which doesn't really happen in the books, but I still think it's a pretty good adaptation from Jackson's point of view. But after this, the gifts are also very, very different. But Jackson, again, does a good job of even putting the 3 hairs that Gimli asked for in the extended cut. It doesn't hit in detail like the book does, but it's still great. And as another side note, I think Jackson does this well with the songs, but Tolkien's work is filled with songs, and I think so is Jackson, but Jackson puts them all in the background. Like when Bilbo sings "The Road Goes Ever On and On" when he leaves the Shire. But I will not forgive Jackson for not including the Song of Durin, which is one of my favorite, and it's been stuck in my head for the last 2 weeks. So a point off for that. But after they leave Lothlorien, they go down the river, and the book says that it takes 9 days. In the books, Legolas shoots down a fell beast, they get attacked by orcs, and they're kind of nervous about what's ahead. All of them seem to dread it. It's one full chapter on the river. And I think actually Jackson is fine to cut that. It's vital to the book plot, knowing the sadness that the Fellowship feels at knowing what must happen soon, and knowing that Frodo is just wrestling with how he should do what he knows he must do. But the movie plotting is simply getting Frodo closer to Mount Doom, which it works for the movie. The temptation of Boromir, though, and his fall is very different from book to movie, and this will be my last real point, because the endings are totally different, which means both have totally different aims. I think in the moment Boromir falls in the movie, you kind of need him to die and for him to redeem himself, which he does. I think it works beautifully in the movies, and his lines he delivers of "I would have followed you, my brother, my captain, my king," are equally beautiful. And I'm so curious in the next book if it will include that, because in the first book, Boromir does not die yet. He betrays Frodo and looks incredibly sad and remorseful, but they all scatter to look for Frodo after Boromir goes back, and then Sam catches Frodo trying to leave with a boat. For the book, that works great, because the cliffhanger that it gives you is just perfect. And so I think the real difference between the book and the movie is that I think they are just going in different aims, because the endings are totally different. In the book, you have Tolkien, who is all writing about this relationship and mainly the relationships that the Fellowship have with each other. And at the end, the breaking of the Fellowship, which is the last chapter of Fellowship of the Ring, you have the breaking of the Fellowship both physically and emotionally. And then also you have this thing where Sam and Frodo kind of break, but then they form up again, and they form even stronger in the end of the book. And so you have everyone in the Fellowship running off and breaking because they've been spending, he's spent an entire book developing the relationships that they all have. So you feel so strongly connected with all of them. Boromir falls because of his temptation. Everything kind of goes all in different directions. Everyone in the Fellowship goes in different directions looking for Frodo. And then Sam meets with him again because Sam is brilliant, and I wrote a whole full essay about him and his brilliance. And then they go and do their own thing. It's like the ending of the book is like, what is going on? I need to pick up the next book immediately. In the movie, I think it's more about this redemption arc that you get with Boromir. I'm not going to say that the whole first movie is really all about the redemption arc that you feel with Boromir, but I kind of think it is, which maybe is messing up my love of Boromir, because I love Boromir so much in the book and I love him so much in the movie. But maybe that's why I'm writing so many essays about Boromir, is because I think he's so great. And I actually think he's one of the focal points of the movie. And when he falls, you kind of see it coming because he's been tempted by the ring before when he's grabbing it. And you see him almost falling into tears in Lothlorien when Galadriel is going into his mind. But when he falls, in that moment, I don't think we should, or we can, wait for the next film for a cliffhanger to see his redemption arc. And so he falls, and then all of a sudden these two hobbits, Merry and Pippin, are out, and Boromir comes back, redeems himself, and then you get this hero's death. And I think it's just a beautiful part in the movie. And I think that's kind of the direction that they were going in the movie. So you had to end with that little section. So anyway, all this to say that Tolkien and the book just win for me. I think they're better, but I still think that the adaptation that Jackson made is good. I think the work that he put into it with the miniatures and the set design and the casting, oh my goodness, I think this cast is perfect. I didn't even talk about that. It's maybe the greatest movie cast of all time. Is there anyone who was poorly cast in this film? I don't think so. But I think Jackson did very well on this adaptation. And I know that a lot of book readers hate this film, but I still think it's one of the best movies of all time. And if you agree with that, make sure you like and you subscribe to this video or to this channel. If you disagree with that, let me know in the comments why you disagree. Let me know all the moments that I missed about all the biggest book to movie changes, because I'm just doing this off the top of my head right now. So I'm gonna miss a ton of stuff. But anyway, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.